Hello, and welcome to Reading the Victorian Novel. I'm Dr. Christian Lehman, and this is the fourth installment of A Tale of Two Cities. This week, we will be looking at the September of 1859 installment, and we're going to cover Book 2, chapters 14 to 18. As a reminder of what happens in these chapters, in chapter 14, The Honest Tradesman, we learn that Jerry Cruncher is a grave robber, and we have the spy's funeral. Chapter 15, Knitting, the mender of roads meets up with the Defarges. Chapter 16, Still Knitting, we have Barsad, the spy. Chapter 17, One Night. Pross and Laurie get up to some shenanigans before Lucy's wedding. It's also when Manette has the just before Manette has the relapse, and that happens in 9 days. Chapter 18. So let's start with The Honest Tradesman. And here is Jerry Cruncher sitting, doing his job. Time was when a poet sat upon a stool in a public place and mused in the sight of men. Mr. Cruncher, sitting on a stool in a public place, but not being a poet, mused as little as possible and looked about him. So the important part here is that this is a direct reference to a specific poet, and that poet is Dante. So what we're going to see is that Dickens actually really likes this use. So in Pictures of Italy, we have Dante used to bring his stool, and in Little Dorrit, Dante sit on a stool for some unaccountable purpose. So one, we're pointing to him, but what's interesting is why point to Dante at this point. And one of the reasons why is it creates part of the network of Cruncher's job, right? Cruncher, we learn, is the honest tradesman. His job is to excavate bodies. He's a grave robber. And like Dante, who in the Inferno goes down into the underworld in something called a catabasis, a journey to the underworld, so too does Cruncher kind of work among the dead, keeping him honest. That's there. So one of the things that happens in this is that we have the funeral of the spy. And I'm interested in it because of how Dickens is describing the crowd. These the people tore to pieces and scattered far and wide with great enjoyment, while the tradesmen hurriedly shut up their shops. For a crowd in those times stopped at nothing and was a monster much dreaded. So crowds have their own energy, right? To become monstrous, and they kind of take away humanity as the people come together in an unhuman-like gathering. Then a little bit later, the remodeled procession started with a chimney sweep driving the hearse, advised by the regular driver, who was perched beside him under close inspection for the purpose, and with a pieman, also attended by his cabinet minister, driving their mourning coach. A bear leader, a popular street character of the time, was impressed as an additional ornament before the cavalcade had quite gone down the Strand. And his bear, who was black and very mangy, gave quite an undertaking air to that part of the procession in which he walked. So a few different things are going on here. Jobs are getting overturned, right? So the chimney sweep, who should be up a chimney, is instead in one of the most prominent visual positions on a street. And the regular driver is there next to him. We also have the bear leader and the bear given a different kind of honorary role, right? The undertaking air, this kind of flipping of the script. This is what's called the carnivalesque, to use a term kind of from Bakhtin, right? Things are not in their place, energies are displaced, society is not running according to its normal structures. And I'm going to come back to some of these things, especially that bear and the blackness of the bear, a little bit later. I did write about this passage in a recent article on the blackness of the chimney sweep, and I'm going to just read what I wrote at that time. The assumption of the coachman, by looking just at the illustration, would be that he's a black coachman, something that the visual vocabulary of the Victorian period would support. Yet here, both the text and the image work together to emphasize that we're seeing an inversion of what is regular. That man looks like a black coachman, and he is a black coachman until we read the words that he's a chimney sweep. Blackened adults are not part of the visual vocabulary, at least in Dickens, of sweeps. He is even more of a destabilizing force than the children, precisely because he does not have the sweeping apparatus, except for the obscured, burnished hat, and also because adult sweeps are not usually shown blackened because they do not climb the chimney. Not, of course, that Dickens's label of a chimney sweep driving the hearse prevents this from being a black man, but it offers an uncomfortable misrecognition and even plausible deniability. More disconcerting is the implicit racism between the black coachman and the bear in the foreground. There's a visual echo of a pole with a loop attached, the whip for the coachman, the chain for the bear, and further, the specific mention of the bear being black and the presence of a dark-featured coachman further suggests the idea that a walking bear is as much an oddity, something not regular, as seeing a black coachman in a Dickensian illustration of a London scene would be. So we'll look at that illustration a little bit later, and that might make some more sense. All right, so Jerry Cruncher goes to the funeral. Mr. Cruncher did not assist at the closing sports, but had remained behind in the churchyard to confer and condole with the undertakers. The place had a soothing influence on him. He procured a pipe from a neighboring public house and smoked it, looking at the air railings and maturely considering the spot. Jerry, said Mr. Cruncher, apostrophizing himself in his usual way, you see that there Cly, that day? See with his own eyes, he's a young un, and a straight maiden. Having smoked his pipe out and ruminated a little longer, he turned himself about, that he might appear, before the hour of closing, on his station at Tellson's. Whether his meditations on mortality had touched his liver, or whether his general health had been previously at all amiss, or whether he desired to show a little attention to an eminent man, is not so much to the purpose as that he made a short call upon his medical advisor, a distinguished surgeon, on his way back. So he, of course, is looking at the spot because he's trying to remember it because he's going to excavate the body later there. He's interested in Cly's body being young and straight because he's planning to sell the bones and the body to the surgeon. So that's like the process of events that have happened there. So just like we had kind of a secret vocabulary concerning Jerry Cruncher, as we move to the Defarges in France in the next chapter, knitting and then still knitting, we also have secret codes. Good day, gentlemen, said Monsieur Defarge. It may have been a signal for loosening the general tongue. It elicited an answering chorus of, good day! It is bad weather, gentlemen, said Defarge, shaking his head, upon which every man looked at his neighbor and then all cast down their eyes and sat silent, except one man who got up and went out. So there's a bunch of different like code languages that have to happen as different people move to their different assigned spots. The Mender of the Roads comes at this point and describes the murder of Gaspard, the lynching of Gaspard. All work is stopped. All assemble there. Nobody leads the cows out. The cows are there with the rest. At midday, the roll of drums. Soldiers have marched into the prison in the night. And he is in the midst of many soldiers. He is bound as before, and in his mouth there is a gag, tied so with a tight string, making him look almost as if he laughed. He suggested it by creasing his face with his 2 thumbs from the corners of his mouth to his ears. On the top of the gallows is fixed the knife blade upwards with its point in the air. He is hanged there 40 feet high and is left hanging, poisoning the water. So I want to do a couple things here. One, this procession is the doppelganger, the double of the funeral procession for Roger Clyde. Here, though, taking the place of that bear in the middle is Gaspard being led, being prodded. So there's a doubling that's happening with these 2 crowd scenes as they're narrated. And both of them concern kind of a dead body as well in some interesting ways. The other thing that I'm interested in is this last part about the gallows, the body, the knife, and the poisoning of the water. I think there's an allegorical way of reading this, whereby Gaspard is the common people of France, and the water is France itself, and the murder of these French citizens is causing a poisoning of the land. Victorian science and previous. Chapter 260. Chateau and hut, stone face and dangling figure, the red stain on the stone floor, and the pure water in the village well. Thousands of acres of land, a whole province of France, all France itself, lay under the night sky, concentrated into a faint, hairbreadth line. So does a whole world, with all its greatnesses and littlenesses, lie in a twinkling star. And as mere human knowledge can split a ray of light and analyze the matter of its composition, so sublimer intelligences may read in the feeble shining of this earth of ours every thought and act, every vice and virtue of every responsible creature on it. So here are some really nice ideas of like even just staring at the night sky, echoes of Galileo, but then it transitions into this idea of inhabited other places. So human knowledge in science can split rays of light, and then human knowledge in philosophy, that's the sublimer intelligences, can work through ethics. So Dickens here is calling on a bunch of different like recent scientific work on light. I talked about Galileo, but a big one is Isaac Newton's optics from 1704. But also maybe even more relevant in the 19th century, you have Goethe's theories of colors that are spreading in 1810. And a little bit after Dickens, you have Babbitt's principles of light and color. So I'm including these here to show like really for 200 years, people are thinking very, very hard about splitting color. So when Dickens uses this scientific language, it's part of a larger scientific idiom that's readily available to him. More just code words here. It was curious the moment Madame Defarge took up the rose, the customers ceased talking and began gradually to drop out of the wine shop. That's going to show up in an illustration, so it's partly why I'm including it. So here's Barsad, who doesn't give his name, but they know who he is because they have extra information, attempting to frame and lure out the Defarges. The unfortunate, miserable people, so oppressed too, as you say. As you say, Madame retorted, correcting him, and deftly knitting an extra something on his name that boded him no good. Pardon me. Certainly it was I who said so, but you naturally think so, of course. I think, returned Madame in a high voice. I and my husband have enough to do to keep this wine shop open without thinking. All we think here is how to live. That is the subject we think of, and it gives us from morning to night enough to think about without embarrassing our heads concerning others. I think for others? No. The spy, who was there to pick up any crumbs he could find or make, did not allow his baffled state to express itself on his sinister face, but stood with an air of gossiping gallantry, leaning his elbow on Madame Defarge's little counter and occasionally sipping his cognac. So, right, this idea that he's trying to frame them so crumbs he could find or make, right? He is, that's what a spy does as he tries to infiltrate. The scene a little bit on the next page with Defarge is particularly excellent as Barsad keeps calling him Jacques. And we have just spent the previous 150 pages reading Defarge use the word Jacques as a name for everybody involved in the revolution. So it's really masterfully done. All right, and the next thing I want to talk about is kind of queering the text, and specifically Laurie and this exchange. So queering the text is an idea that Dickens is not going to have overtly homosexual characters, but there are still people that are homosexual. And so some, maybe the evidence is stronger, others might just not be, have normative homes. And so one space to look at is bachelorhood. So here is this example. Dear me, this is an occasion that makes a man speculate on all he has lost. Dear, dear, dear. To think there might have been a Mrs. Laurie any time these 50 years almost. Not at all. From Miss Pross. You think there might never have been a Mrs. Laurie? Asked the gentleman of that name. Ha, said Miss Pross. You were a bachelor in your cradle. Well, observed Mr. Laurie, beamingly adjusting his little wig. That seems probable too. And you were cut out for a bachelor, pursued Miss Pross, before you were put in your cradle. Then, I think, said Mr. Laurie, that I was very unhandsomely dealt with, and I ought to have had a voice in the selection of my pattern. So here Miss Pross sees through him and is like, you are clearly not a heterosexual man, or you are not a marriageable man, a man inclined towards marriage, sees something inside of him. And then he kind of has this great bit about it being a pattern, right? So Miss Pross kind of is implying that homosexuality is not a choice. So it's really some interesting ideas that are happening just below the surface, right? That's that queering aspect of the text. If you're interested in such approaches to Dickens, there's a quite excellent book by Holly Furneaux on queer Dickens, erotics, families, and masculinities. she looks at a lot of non-normative homes that happen in and other queer spaces in Dickens's novels. On to a different idea, which is about Lucy. So one thing that I'm really interested in around Lucy is to what degree does she lack agency, and to what degree is she forced to lack agency and not given a chance to exercise it. So this is after Manette has had his relapse. Two things at once impress themselves on Mr. Lorry as important above all others. The first, that this must be kept secret from Lucy. The second, that it must be kept secret from all who knew him. In conjunction with Miss Pross, he took immediate steps towards the latter precaution by giving out that the doctor was not well and required a few days of complete rest. In aid of the kind deception to be practiced on his daughter, Miss Pross was to write describing his having been called away professionally and referring to an imaginary letter of 2 or 3 hurried lines in his own hand, represented to have been addressed to her by the same post. And then at the end of the chapter, Lucy was unconscious and happy. So I think there's 2 different ways of looking at this. One, it is a kindness, because they want Lucy to have a nice time on her wedding, on her honeymoon. Other is that they're infantilizing her. So even though she is married and she's supposed to be entering the stage of maturity, they're keeping information from her and they're preventing her from being able to respond to changes of circumstance that are precisely that which would give her a chance to exercise her own agency. So I think this thing that's happening is that Lorry and Pross prevent her from maturing and prevent her from being a character with greater agency. Here's just something else to think about quickly about Pross and Lorry. They provide an interesting intersection. So the only thing they have in common is really Lucy and the fact that I guess they're both single, but they otherwise don't align. Pross is a servant, Lorry's a rich banker, Pross is a woman, Lorry is a man, Pross is loud, Lorry's quiet, Pross is youngish, Lorry is old. But they're united kind of through Lucy, through this light, to create a non-normative family, almost an alternative domestic arrangement, and they end up being able to collude. So even though they are on these different spectrums of British society, they find a common space. On to the illustrations. So here is the spy's funeral. So earlier I talked about here's the black coach or the coachman who is in a form of blackface. There's his whip right there. The coach is, and that echoes the chain that's muzzling the bear right here. The bear is mangy and actually black, right? So we get that kind of that echo right there that's happening. Back here, there's Jerry Cruncher, always recognizable with his hair. And then just a general energy scene. In the next month's installment, this energy will be imitated with the sea rising when the French Revolution is happening. So keep that kind of in the background of your minds. Here's the wine shop. So there's Barsad sipping his cognac. Here is Madame Defarge. There's the rose. And here's Monsieur Defarge lighting his pipe. Some interesting elements down here, right? This is what's called a caryatid, but it's a female figure kind of weighed down and burdened, almost implying the visual of how the French people are feeling. This guy, you can tell his eyes looking in. Should I go in? Oh, nope, I see the rose. It's not time for me to go in. The secret signal has been conveyed to him. John McLennan's illustrations for this. I am absolutely in love with this image of the fantasy that young Cruncher has of the coffin chasing him. It's just spectacular. Juxtaposed to this very dark image of the grave robbing, prying open the coffin, looking suspiciously around. Even the steeple there with these shadows, it kind of creates a face looking down at them, what's called pareidolia, when you see faces inside other objects. And then Jerry Cruncher doing the prying. The next chapter, very, very dark. Here is Gaspard at the hanging over the fountain. And then this is the mender of roads and the Jacquerie watching with great intensity, hearing about what had happened just over here. The next one that we see here, again, Madame Defarge. You can kind of make out her Bose right there. There's the cup of cognac, and there's Defarge smoking his pipe. Again, I'm very interested in the similarities between McLennan and Fizz. I'm still kind of trying to figure out how this happened, if there was some kind of instruction that McLennan must have gotten, because it just seems too strange that now twice in a row we've had these direct kind of imitations of the same scene that's happening. But I can't see how Fizz is getting McLennan's in time to publish them at the end of the month. Then in the last installment here, we have Laurie and Miss Pross. Here they're hearing the relapse. This is just a funny point of irony. C, said the doctor of Beauvais. This is the doctor talking about the moon and how he used to look at it, but his arm is covering up Lucy's eyes, so she can't see. It's kind of like a visual oddity. All right, and then finally, in this installment of Harper's, there's a very intriguing rumor that Dickens is going to come to America. So in conclusion, I'm just going to read this. Bose. Many uncertain rumors have at length assumed the form of a distinct and apparently authorized assertion that Mr. Dickens is coming to America again to read to public. So he's not going to come until 1867. This is not anything that is happening. But the author of this little editorial takes the time now to talk about his first reading and then how they feel as a public about Dickens. It is more than 17 years since he arrived in Boston upon his previous visit. He had written Pickwick, Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, The Old Curiosity Shop, and Barnaby Rudge. He was not yet 30 years old. And then jumping ahead, he had his own purposes perhaps in coming here, and when he returned, he wrote a book about us. The worst that can be said of that book is it was bad policy. He wrote freely what he thought and instantly alienated an entire national sympathy. On the 1st of January, 1842, there was perhaps no man in the world who had so universal a personal regard in America as Dickens. On the 1st of January, 1843, that personal feeling was quite gone, and he was coolly acknowledged to be only a distinguished novelist. Since his visit, that familiar, affectionate title of Bose has been quite forgotten. He is, and for many years has been, Mr. Charles Dickens. The remarkable change was, of course, partly the reaction of our own enthusiasm, of which we were possibly a little ashamed, and so made our idol, our scapegrace. But the change itself is beyond dispute, and although the lapse of time has softened the feeling, and a new generation reads and delights in him for itself, that fresh, loyal, and lyrical enthusiasm is gone forever. Nor is it to be denied that 23 years of active literary life have worn off the wonder of novelty, that his later works have been less popularly liked, although he commands more readers than any author, and that recent private events in his life, both domestic and commercial, have not fostered a kinder feeling toward him on this side of the sea. There will be no repetition of the old reception, but there can be no doubt of the success of his tour. Mr. Kemble's triumphs in reading Shakespeare are a foreshadowing of Dickens's in reading Dickens. It is just the thing we all like, and it is, if we may judge from unanimous report, perfectly done. Kind of interesting here, this idea of recent private events in his life, domestic and commercial, have not fostered a kind feeling. That has to do commercially with his intense attacks on piracy of his works, but the domestic has to do with his very public separation from Catherine. And so it's interesting that even in the pages of this, they are talking about it. So with that, we come to an end, and we will look forward to the 5th monthly installment next week.